I'm very thankful to be invited here at a very prestigious event held by the Korea Research Institute at the University of New South Wales. My title today for the next 20 minutes, this will be my presentation. My title will be Post-COVID Recovery, Harnessing the Digital Platforms. As you already know, that COVID-19 is major disruption of the economy, not only Indonesia, but also throughout the world's economy. But it turns out to be, it gives you two perspectives. One is the shortcomings coming from the natural phenomena of the disruption itself. And the second one is the opportunity coming also from the pandemic as the major disruptive event to this 2020 and 2021. Some of the major highlighted points. First is Indonesia managed to overcome the recession period by growing positively in Q2 and Q3 2021. In Q2, we managed to grow 7.07%, followed by 3.51% at Q3. 7.07% is relatively high because it is coming from a very low base effect in 2020. In Q2 2020, we only managed to survive, and we had a major contraction of minus 5.3%, which is actually understandable. In Q2 2021, we grew to 7.07% because it is coming from a low base effect. In Q3, 3.51%. It's not as high as the previous period, of course, but it is actually still a very fortunate event despite the shock that is coming in Q3, coming from the Delta variant. So this is really good news for the Indonesian economy. And not to mention that the inoculation strategy has going very well. We have the inoculated population more than 50%, which is actually quite considerable. Although if you compare it with other developed nations, it's not as much, but this is actually, we are going on the right track. And speaking of the opportunity, we have during the pandemic, higher adoption of digital technologies. And this is coming across several actors in the economy. This one is some of the macroeconomic analysis. This coming from the output from the variance decomposition. This picture, this graph tells you that we have several major shocks to the economy. And the most dominant form of shocks is coming from COVID-19. It is 17 to 18% of the overall shocks to the economy coming from COVID, which is the first ranked among other variable or among other shocks. Although COVID-19 itself is non-traditional and unprecedented, but it is managed to going up in the rankings, and it also tells you that managing the pandemic is very crucial. So it is actually a sequential strategy, not a trade-off to the economy. So if you manage and you prioritizing the pandemic, it's actually you are also recovering the economy. It's actually a sequence, not a trade-off. Some of the highlighted facts coming from the variance decomposition. First one, about the COVID-19 itself, especially coming into the second and the third quarter, the rampaging effect of COVID is becoming much worse. So this is, of course, understandable given the contagious manner that COVID is giving to the overall population, and it is also have a very adverse effect to the economy. Another shock factor is coming from the inflation, the consumer price index, the CPI. The influence of the CPI itself is also possible to become one of the strongest after COVID. But to be exact, nowadays, and especially in the period of 2021 and maybe it is possible 2022, we have a very low possibility of increasing inflation rate. Although some say it, and some experts also see this will become a major variable after COVID. But things turns out to be nowadays is actually managed well by the central bank and also the government. But we have another transmission mechanism coming from other shocks variable. Here we have exports. Export is actually giving you a very positive effect to the GDP until not until the second quarter of the year. But given the nature that export nowadays are predominantly coming from the commodities, if you're doing a very aggressive export in commodities, you'll be only giving the economy much trouble. As it is actually showed here that we have a very contractionary period until the fourth and the eighth quarter of the year, meaning that the first and the second year of administrative period. This will actually giving you the possibility of a contractionary effect to the economy. Why? Because here, as you can see it from the shocks coming from the oil itself is actually going positively to the economy. But if we have a very myopic policy at the form of exporting commodities, which is actually very important to production. Nowadays, we have an oversupply condition in the economy, but if you are actually aggravating this factor, aggressively doing and pushing export of the commodity, the oversupply tendency to the economy will be diminished eventually. So to that, we will be exposed to the dynamics of the global commodity prices. At that expense, we have a very high possibility of having imported inflation that may affect the CPI. The CPI itself, as I told you earlier, is actually the second largest shock to the economy. So given the limited supply of the commodity and the input of production based on coming from the aggressive export, which is actually we need to moderate the export and not to do it aggressively. But if we are doing it too aggressive, this will, as I said, will diminish the oversupply condition, and this will be actually quite posing a threat to the economy at the form of imported inflation. So this will be becoming a major threat, major source of threat to the Indonesian economy if we are not careful. Speaking of the impact of those shocks, those dominant shocks, as I said before, this will actually give you a very contractionary effect to the economy. As I already told you before, the shock will be coming also from the export, giving you a very negative externalities given the aggressivity, and the COVID itself will be exposing the economy and will be having a contractionary effect to the economy to minus 0.73% in the next 2 quarters. So COVID itself is the most dominant, and it is actually giving you a major contraction. And this is a very dominant contraction, coming from COVID itself. As I said, this should be a sequential strategy, not a trade-off. But you need to also to be careful to other shocks, which is currently is actually very is having a limited possibility to become a major threat. But if we are not careful, as I said before, if we are doing export aggressively and then we diminish the foundation of the economy, which is actually quite good in terms of oversupply and the input of production. In that case, if we are having a very limited supply, so will be exposed to the import inflation. So here from the export side, we'll be having a contractionary effect to the economy. The largest response being this 0.4% contraction in the fourth quarter of the economy. It's not immediate, yeah. If you from the immediate effect, you can see it from the commodity prices coming to the export of the commodity. Here, the response of the Indonesia's GDP to the shock of oil prices will be positive, 0.48% in the second quarter and 0.3% in the fourth quarter of the year. But this may reflect a major threat in the midterm and the long run coming from the export side, yeah, which will be diminishing the condition of oversupply, and the response will be negative 0.46%, which is quite big in terms of negative effect. So this should be considered of. Coverage of course, is giving you a major shock to the economy. So we call it the Keynesian domino effect. Jean-Baptiste paradigm once said that supply creates its own demand. But from COVID perspective, we can say that supply contraction gives you a demand contraction. And one of the most biggest contraction coming from the sectors that depends much on mobility, such as the retail, accommodation, food services, transports, and so on and so forth. But because the demand for the specific sector is also the demand for the other sector of the economy, because we have the supply contraction, then contract the demand to that sector, then this sector is actually quite interchangeably related to the other sector, then this creates actually the domino effect. But eventually, we'll learn that the Indonesian economy can survive through several sectors that can be the anchor for the future economy. As for the labor condition, of course, we have major shock, as I told you before, as I showed you in the previous slide. So this is the more granular condition, which is having a rise in unemployment in big cities and also throughout Indonesia, which is actually quite considerable. Yeah, and we have also the increasing level and percentage of the unpaid family workers. So the working condition is becoming depleted over time. But at the same time, we also have the increasing rate, the increasing level, the increasing number of micro entrepreneurs. Is according to the statistics of Indonesia, not less than 1 million of workers being becoming micro entrepreneurs. So how can that be? So I will tell you later how they can actually evolve into micro entrepreneurs. Now moving to the stock market and also the exchange rate. Into the IDX or the stock market, we have a very considerable growth, yeah, throughout the year, yeah, 9% year to date, with the highest growth was recorded by the technology sector, with year-on-year growth of more than 800% or 600% year to date. So this is actually a very, very huge phenomenon that is actually becoming one on the anchor of the economy. Speaking of the exchange rate itself is quite volatile by nature, but although it's having a depreciation of 1.97% throughout as of 15 December 2021, but this is actually quite considerable, yeah, given the nature of volatility of the rupiahs. And the relatively stable condition is coming from two variables, two sectors. The first one is coming from the manufacturing condition. The purchasing manager index in manufacturing is quite solid. It was having a very tough moment in 2020, but after 2020, with some of the fiscal and non-fiscal intervention, we managed to see a very solid rebound of the purchasing manager index in manufacturing that will explain the export growth throughout the period. So with the condition of the export coming from the manufacturing sectors, which is actually quite solid, this actually becoming a major and a positive factor to the stability of rupiah. Another factor, as I said before, also coming from export, but is coming from the export of the commodities. But one thing for sure, we cannot actually expect this in the long run, or even in the midterm, because as I said before, if we have if we push export in commodity too aggressively, it will be having also a contractionary effect to the economy. And with that, will also posing a threat to rupiah's volatility. So in that case, we have a very solid groundwork of the industry. So so the investment, the priority should be there in the industrial growth. Having several shocks in mind, coming from COVID, commodity prices, inflation, and so on and so forth, we have several scenarios to 2021 and also 2022. The most likely scenario for 2021 will be around this point, 3.5%. And in 2022 will be around moderate to optimist, which is 4.5% to 5.5%. So yeah, I'm a very optimist of 2022 because some of the most possible shocks is actually quite manageable. Although we have to be careful of the possibility of having another shock coming from Omicron. But speaking to the data, Delta variant itself is quite rampaging, but as we go throughout the period, we managed to do well both in health and also in the economy. So, it is expected that although maybe we will be having another shock coming from the Omicron, but we will be having a higher possibility to overcome it better than the previous period. Oh, so this is the timeline of the series of intervention: fiscal intervention, monetary intervention, non-fiscal intervention, starting from January 2020. And you can see several interventions took place, and I will be highlighting several part of it. The first one is the fiscal policy. Yeah, from this is actually at the form of the government stimulus. The National Recovery Program, or we call it in Bahasa Indonesia, Program Pemulihan Ekonomi Nasional, PEN. This is actually coming very, very significant to the economy. And it has the priority to push and to manage the MSMEs, which is actually quite dominant in the economy, accounts for 60% of the Indonesia gross domestic product and 97% of domestic workforce. So the government of Indonesia is prioritizing to this very sector as the lifeline of the economy. Around 600 to 700 trillion of rupiahs coming to several structures: social security, SMEs, health, corporate financing, business incentives, and so on and so forth. Although it is quite modest if you compare it with other countries, especially coming from developed countries, but it is actually quite significant in terms of impact. This is some simulation that we managed to do over the course of the year. So if all the stimulus is actually efficiently distributed, we'll be having a very positive effect to the economy. The total stimulus will be going and to manage to increase the possibility of having a positive growth. In 2020, according to our simulation, without the government stimulus, as we can see from the data, in 2020, we managed to grow. It's not growing, it's actually a contractionary period, minus 2.07%. But this is actually quite considered and quite fortunate with the impact of the fiscal stimulus. Without the fiscal stimulus, in 2020, we might have a very high contractionary effect, about -4 to -5% of contraction. So this is actually very significant. So although we have some, of course, some complexities in distributing and managing the fund, but it turns out to be in 2020 alone, it is actually quite considerable. And it is also expected in this 2021, one of the major anchor of the economy is coming from the government spending. Coming to the monetary policy, the monetary policy itself is quite dynamic, and it is actually very considerate given the enormous impact of COVID-19. So it is actually also giving a stimulus at the form of a decreasing rate of the Bank Indonesia 7 days repo rate from 4.5% in March 2020 and now steadily at the level of 3.5% since February 2021. And it is quite low given the nature of rupiah's volatility, and so this is actually quite a very generous policy from the Bank Indonesia, or the Central Bank of Indonesia. And it turns out to be some positive event is also affecting this generous policy. As I told you before, rupiah is quite stable by nature, coming from the fundamentals of the economy that is quite strong and solid. And also we have a very managed risk to the economy, given that the shocks coming from COVID is quite manageable. The central bank is also trying to help the government by purchasing state securities, and it is actually in order to push the economy, in order to actually giving the stability and giving an extra comfort to the government in order to give the fiscal stimulus to the economy. So to fund the 2021 state budget over the 142 trillion demand of the budget, the government is actually having a policy mix with the central bank within the primary market at the form of the main option 67 trillion rupiahs and the green shoe option 75 trillion rupiahs. And as a result of this expansionary monetary policy, we have a liquidity increasing, yeah, at the form of M1 grew at the level of 11% year on year and brought money. M2 grew by 8% year on year, and this is well supported by also by the bank credit, and this bank credit is very much affected of the risk factor in the economy, which is quite manageable over the course of 2021, so that the motivation to the credit expansion is already there. Coming to the trade policy, this is also a very generous policy, because the government starting April of 2020 is actually creating a very a good stimulus and a non-fiscal stimulus in terms of accommodating the import for the production processes. And it turns out to be circumstantially, of course, over the course of the year, coming from the non-fiscal stimulus, we have the purchasing manager index in manufacturing having a very solid rebound since its low condition in March and April 2020. And since then, yeah, we have a very solid growth of the purchasing manager index in manufacturing. Even in the 2021, in May, if I'm not mistaken, we managed to achieve one of the highest ever recorded, yeah, in purchasing manager index in manufacturing, one of which circumstantially, of course, coming from the non-fiscal intervention, that giving you an ease of the input of production to the production processes. For the health policy itself, we have several activities and several strategies at the form of large-scale social restriction, PSBB, and also the community activities restriction enforcement, PPKM. And also, we're actually giving a very massive inoculation at the form of 5,000 of first dose vaccines have been administered for every 10,000 population, which is actually quite considerate. And also, coming from the restriction strategy, it turns out to be it is posing a very good effect to rupiahs and also the exchange rate. As you can see here, the stock market and the rupiahs, after having the period of restriction, is actually managed to do well, yeah, afterwards. So this is actually a reflection that the market is actually seeing the restriction period, the restriction activities, as a very positive attitude coming from the government that is actually well prioritizing the health sector, which is, as I told you before, is a very sequential strategy. It's not a trade-off. It is actually giving you a very positive effect, both in the stock market and also the exchange rate. So we have now the sectoral activities. What will I tell you in this respective slides are actually some sectors are actually the champion of the pandemic, and it's actually becoming major attributes of the future economic recovery in Indonesia. So coming from the input and output analysis and the value added multiplier and so on and so forth, it is actually safe to say that the industrial growth are actually very much benefited by the sectoral growth in terms of the ICT, yeah, as robustly justified from my previous slide before, that this one is actually becoming the major attributes of recovery, because the ICT sector itself is actually is actually is not exclusive. The growth is not exclusive. It is actually inclusive growth, meaning that this very sector can engage other sector also to thrive. So in that case, if another sector that is actually trying to survive in the period of pandemic coming into the digital platforms, they're actually more than survive. They can be leapfrogging from the previous condition. And as I said before, that micro entrepreneurs are actually quite growing, most of them coming also from the engaging action to the digital platforms. But of course, we have several challenges coming from this very sector. In terms of connectivity, 49% of the Indonesian adults are still unconnected across various special economic and also social dimensions. In terms of internet access, while the mobile broadband does well enough to penetrate the population, placing fourth in the overall 4G adoption among the ASEAN countries, the fixed broadband, which is actually becoming a major pivotal point, is lagging severely with only 4% of population or 16% of households. Is actually lagging behind or from the regional peers of Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and also Brunei. A fixed broadband subscription is still considered as expensive by many. This is actually one of the factors. Another factor is the internet quality offered by both mobile and fixed are among the lowest in ASEAN. This is actually also creating the shortcomings and the contractionary, also the constraining factor to the future of economy. The World Bank itself lists main drivers of the limited access to good quality internet in Indonesia: limited spectrum, unavailability of specific bands, limited regulatory clarity on infrastructure sharing, and also lack of competition. This should be tackled in the following years, of course. Another interesting fact: Indonesia is the fifth most internet engaged country in the world. This is actually creating the opportunity. We have time spent in terms of internet distribution: 36% to do communication, 21% to do social media, 21% to leisure activities, 11% for browsing, 7% of others, and only 3% for buying and selling in e-commerce. So although the e-commerce growth itself is quite engaging, but there is actually always room for improvement. If we can push these activities of buying and selling transaction in e-commerce, this will actually giving a very major benefit to the consumer in terms of the providing cheaper options, greater product variety, convenience, and enable the consumers to obtain good previously unavailable in their area, and also giving you extra income, of course, coming into this very sector, but only 3% of which being spent into. Another thing is about the MSMEs and internet adoption. So again, there is always room for improvement. Here, we have the data of internet usage, not using internet for work and using internet for work. It's actually quite considered in terms of using internet for work, but mostly coming to the communication activities, not for promotion and transaction. This also justifies the previous findings. Around 58% of the SMEs and 32% of the micro firms reported by the World Bank adopted internet-related strategy in order to cope with the pandemic. So, this is actually the opportunity. Of course, there's still room for improvement, but the COVID itself, the pandemic, is actually creating a way to survive. Here, 58% of the SMEs is actually quite engaged by 2D digital platforms. But the problem is, what about the other MSMEs who cannot utilize this digital engagement? My expectation and the possible future of this marginal condition will be the digital divide. Surely, this is actually the one that we should actually avoid. So in that case, the government needs to facilitate the environment in order to diminish the digital divide possibility. Another thing about is actually the low rate of internet adoption among workers. Almost 75% of Indonesia of non-agricultural employment. And in 2019 alone, is only 27% of all workers reported using the internet at their work. So again, a room for improvement. So our proposal is to have a more engaging collaboration across actors. We call it the quadruple helix ecosystem, coming from the business, university, community, and also the government. With that, the possibility of having the positive externalities and utilizing the momentum for the future economy, not only in the recovery period, but also the future economic growth is actually already there. So to conclude, it is actually safe to say that post-COVID recovery will be quite challenging, of course, but if we manage to overcome the respected shocks, if we manage to utilize the engaging sector, maybe, just maybe, we're not only surviving the worst period, but also to have a greater momentum, a leapfrogging, and also a quantum leap towards a high growth foundation in the future. Okay, thank you very much. I think this is all for me.